And I was just thinking about, and if autism is a superpower and a superpower is an advantage, could you sell it to someone who doesn't have it? And I think the answer is no. But if you were selling a superpower, sure, who wouldn't want to buy the ability to fly? Who wouldn't want to buy the ability to be invisible?
The neurodiversity movement has opened doors for understanding and acceptance. But what happens when some voices still get left out? What if the conversation doesn't fully reflect the diversity of the spectrum itself? Kaelynn Partlow is an autism advocate, speaker, and author. And you may recognize her from Season 1 on the Netflix series Love on the Spectrum. She's sharing her thoughts on what true inclusion looks like, how we can reframe strengths without ignoring struggles, and why nuance matters. That's straight ahead on episode 276. I'm Emily Kircher-Morris, and this is the Neurodiversity Podcast.
What is neurodiversity?
You see the world differently.
Autism spectrum.
Gifted.
Complexities that are inherently inside.
ADHD.
Dysgraphia.
Tourette's.
All brains are different.
You are exactly what this world needs.
This is the
Neurodiversity
Podcast.
You know, podcasting can feel a little like talking into the void. But when someone shares an episode or leaves a review or even just messages to say, hey, this one really hit home, it reminds me that you're out there listening. So if you haven't already, just take a second to leave a rating or review wherever you listen. It really does help more people find us. And if you want to connect with our community, hop on over to Facebook and join the Neurodiversity Podcast Advocacy and Support Group. We're on all the other socials too, so come on over and say hi. Links are in the show notes. Okay, Kaelynn is here with me next.
On rejection sensitivity dysphoria with Dr. Bill Dodson.
It's important for people to start with the notion of, I have a neurodiverse nervous system, but I'm not defective. The importance of this is that it proves to them that they're already doing what they need to do. They are survivors. They got this far on their own, and so they can keep doing it. You're already doing everything it takes to master your nervous system. So those are two fundamental changes in how a person thinks about themselves.
It makes all the difference.
There's nothing either good nor bad, but thinking makes it so.
Look for episodes 256 and 257 in your favorite podcast app.
Joining me today is Kaelynn Partlow, an autism advocate, speaker, and author. You might recognize her from the Netflix series Love on the Spectrum. Kaelynn has used that platform, along with her social media presence, to share a message of acceptance, understanding, and practical support for the autistic community, reaching millions in the process. She's the author of Life on the Bridge, where she draws from both her personal experiences and her work as a registered behavior technician to help bridge the gap in communication and connection between autistic and non-autistic people. Through her work with Project Hope, she's developed training programs, led therapy sessions, and traveled the country sharing what truly meaningful inclusion can look like. Kaelynn, thanks for being here.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
So I want to start off our conversation talking about moms as advocates. My own mom played a huge role in getting my ADHD diagnosis back in the early 90s, which was before we even had Asperger's in the DSM. Like it was, just really kind of the Wild West, even as far as ADHD diagnoses have gone. But I would love to hear a bit more about your experience and about how your mom supported you and what stands out to you now when you look back on that time when you were a child.
I think one of the major things that stands out to me is kind of similar to what you were saying. The diagnosis or the professionals who were qualified to make the diagnosis really were uninformed about what they were looking for. They told my mom that I couldn't possibly be on the spectrum, despite her bringing up concerns to my pediatricians, because I am a girl and I had a lot of language. In fact, I spoke early. I spoke at the age of 8 months. My speech has always been intelligible. I was toilet trained early. I, for the most part, met my developmental milestones in the way that most people would expect. However, there were lots of skill deficits within that and still behavioral excesses. that doctors refused to explore because I was speaking and I was a girl. And those two factors alone were what single-handedly delayed me from getting a diagnosis until the year 2007.
It makes such a huge difference in the understanding for professionals. And even now, as a mental health clinician, I know that there's still a huge gap in awareness about what those traits look like and the various ways that they show up. When your mom was reaching out to these professionals, I'm sure she hit a lot of barriers, a lot of obstacles, trying to get some answers. Have you ever had a chance to talk to her about what it was that kept her through that process? I mean, I guess she just knew that something still wasn't adding up.
Yeah, as I've gotten older, you learn more about your childhood. You learn to ask more specific questions from your parents, and you see things differently. And I guess it would be fair to say that I took a little bit of an ego hit. When I was very, very young, like before the age of 5, both of my parents believed that it was possible that I could have an advanced IQ or be some sort of genius in some capacity. And they didn't really specify why outside of my language and my ability to absorb information. But then they were kind of crushed to find out that I had learning disabilities. And so, or maybe I was crushed, it's just what a turnaround, right? To think, this person might have a genius IQ. Actually, her IQ is only 70 or 80 because she can't read at the time of testing. So that really will knock your score down quite a bit, unfortunately. I think the things that probably stood out to her would be the persistent sensory issues and then the social skill deficits. I would have conflicts with peers. I would not know how to initiate social interaction or maintain social interaction or know how to respond when things kind of went sideways. I struggled to repair conflict or to prevent conflict. And having repeated social challenges as a very young child was probably one of the driving factors in her wanting me to be assessed.
I'm thinking about the fact that there are so many parents who are hesitant about labeling their kids. Part of the thing that I'll often share with families when they're talking about, well, should we go through a diagnostic process? Should we see if there's a label? What if my child has this label and then they feel like that defines them? I'll often talk about the fact that it's better to give an accurate label instead of something that they're going to internalize otherwise, like I'm a bad kid or I'm dumb or whatever. And I feel like that's something that a lot of neurodivergent people can kind of reflect on and recognize through their experiences. And I'm wondering if that's something that you connect with.
Yeah, definitely. I feel like, the thing I'll tell you is the thing I kind of tell everybody when people come to me with concerns about labeling their child, which is that you either label your child correctly with an autism diagnosis, an ADHD diagnosis, bipolar diagnosis, whatever it is, or the world will label them for you and you're not going to like it. It's going to be stupid. It's going to be dumb. It's going to be slow. It's going to be weird. It's going to be some horrific thing that they're going to attach to their identity very early on, because if there's something different about this person, other people are going to notice and they're going to call it out and they're going to call it not what it is. They're going to name it something else. And that something else is going to be attached to some really negative descriptors that are going to harm your view of yourself and your identity. So I would much rather be called autistic than dumb or stupid or weird.
And that's such a hard thing because there's so much stigma surrounding all of those labels.
Right.
I understand parents who are cautious and hesitant and worried because the world is not created for people who show up differently in whatever that means. It's a balancing act, I think, for parents, but I do think it's empowering for kids overall.
Oh, yeah.
I think one of the things I really appreciate about both the book that you've written as well as like your Instagram and all of your social media presence is the fact that you really try to dive into the nuance of what it means to be autistic and neurodivergent in today's world. Because so often when we talk about neurodiversity, those conversations get flattened into these overly simplified ideas, but the reality really is much more complex. And let's be honest, like social media is not a platform that allows for a lot of nuance or complexity. And so I think it's just really important that we hold space for that nuance. I'm wondering how you kind of approach this, why you feel like it's important to have those conversations from your own experience in spaces like education and mental health and advocacy.
I think it's important because people need to see it. And that's kind of the approach I take, at least online, is we can say, hey, we should be kind to people who are different. We can say that inclusion matters. We can say that sometimes autism means that you might behave in ways that are unusual. Sometimes autism means that you might stim, or, you'll flap your hands, you'll rock, you'll pace. But people need to see that. They need to see, what does different look like? What does it look like to struggle with social skills? What does it look like to have a hard time with communication? Because we can use descriptive language all day long, but if you haven't seen it, it really doesn't mean much to you. And when you do see it, you won't see it for what it is. You'll see it for something totally different.
I have a few of these areas that I would like to explore with you a little bit, where I feel like the nuance sometimes is missed. And so the first one specifically that I want to ask you about is this oversimplified ideas that we sometimes hear, for example, the phrase, autism is a superpower. I understand why that resonates with people because it really can feel empowering, but it also, I feel like, is a bit dismissive of the real challenges that autistic people face. What are your thoughts about framing autism or other types of neurodivergence as superpowers?
I'm pretty against it. Last night, I was watching Shark Tank on TV. Have you seen that show before?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I was watching Shark Tank, and I just had the thought of, how they've got to describe their product, they've got to describe all the features, they've got to describe all the benefits, and then eventually they get to the hard stuff and they start explaining, we're not here yet with marketing, or we're struggling with production. They start to kind of unveil the more challenging aspects surrounding their business. And I was just thinking about, and if autism is a superpower and a superpower is an advantage, could you sell it to someone who doesn't have it? And I think the answer is no. But if you were selling a superpower, sure, who wouldn't want to buy the ability to fly? Who wouldn't want to buy the ability to be invisible? But could you sell somebody autism? Would someone want to buy autism? Probably not. Therefore, it's not a superpower.
Yeah, I love that. That's such a great comparison and puts it in really concrete terms. I think that many people who are verbally abled would recognize that being autistic, being ADHD, being whatever, is a core component of who they are, and they don't want to necessarily change that. And I feel like that's the message that they're trying to send when they say that. Mm-hmm. But I do think that, especially for people who maybe aren't as familiar with all of the complications and difficulties that come along with it, it minimizes those struggles. It makes it feel like it should just be no big deal, which I feel like then prevents people from getting the support that they need.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
Do you think that there's a more helpful or accurate way to talk about strengths that come along with the struggles of neurodivergence?
I mean, that's a tough one.
Mm-hmm.
I think my approach to it is probably different than a lot of other people's approach to it. I am intrigued by precision in language. So I don't mind saying a long mouthful of words where I describe to you that, yes, autism is an advantage in some instances, but overall it is not a net gain. And that's not as concise as saying autism is a superpower. Mm-hmm. It's much more drawn out and a longer explanation. But I think that's the solution. And I don't know that that's a viable solution because, like I said, it's not as catchy. It's not a cute little soundbite that people like to attach onto. But that's my view, is to be more descriptive.
Another area that I feel like loses a lot of nuance, and this is something that I feel like you've done another really good job of exploring on your platforms, is the concept of profound autism, which is, first of all, a term in and of itself that can be controversial depending on who you're asking. At this time, it's not a formal diagnostic term, but it's been suggested in the literature through some research. And often that idea of profound autism compared with what many people who are part of the neurodiversity movement or the neurodiversity community experience, sometimes those things can cause tension about who gets included in broader conversations. I'd love to get your take on what it is important for people to understand about autistic individuals with higher support needs and how we make sure that advocacy doesn't leave them out.
What a loaded question. I knew you were going to ask about it. And so in preparation for this, I had copied and pasted over to my notes the proposed updating of the definition for profound autism, which is 6 relatively lengthy bullet points. But again, kind of going back to my previous sentiment that precision in language is maybe what saves us here in some capacity, right? So I do have that if you would like for me. I'm not familiar enough to just pull it out of thin air.
Rattle them.
I feel like people don't know what profound autism is. So from the International Society for Autism Research in the beginning of May, they proposed a brand new definition, or an updating, I guess, rather. So number 1, meets the diagnostic criteria for autism, pretty basic. Number 2, is at least 8 years old, acknowledging that some characteristics consistent with profound autism are evident earlier. Number 3, requires adult supervision exceeding age-appropriate levels due to risks of elopement, injury, or lack of environmental awareness. Number 4, inability to independently perform most activities of daily living, so bathing, feeding, dressing, that sort of thing. Number 5 is severely impaired cognitive abilities reflected by IQ under 50 and this is important, it's and/or, generally does not verbally communicate other than single words or fixed phrases to have only basic needs met. Eat, go, stop, that sort of thing. And then number 6, these characteristics are neither intermittent nor transient and persist across different environmental settings and situations. So these are folks who are not going nonverbal. I don't know if you're familiar with that phrasing online, but it's something that really bothers me.
Right.
Because in the same way that an autism diagnosis can be a defining characteristic of a person's identity, so can being nonverbal or non-speaking, whatever you want to call it, that is a defining characteristic of a person's identity. And so to say I'm going nonverbal would be like I'm turning autistic. That's just kind of silly. You might say I'm experiencing situational mutism. I have experienced a temporary loss of my verbal abilities. You might say I'm having a verbal shutdown. But to say I'm going nonverbal, I don't know. It really bothers me. And I really appreciate that they've added that 6th defining characteristic of that these are not intermittent come and go kinds of situations. This is not about preference. This is the top of someone's skill level. The most they could possibly do is communicate basic wants and needs. This is not a preference for shorthand communication. So I definitely appreciate these more specific criteria.
Yeah, I appreciate you sharing those. I do think it really helps to understand what it is clearly that we're talking about. And that is always the nuance that gets missed on social media. Why do you think it's so important to focus on the fact that for people who have those higher support needs, who might qualify under those particular parameters, why is it important to make sure that we're also bringing those needs into the conversation? What's getting missed in the neurodiversity conversation?
I mean, if you really looked at all that neurodiversity online encompasses, I would say most things are probably missed. It's only a certain subsect of the population, really, the human population, and then especially the neurodiverse population, who are able to get online and get their words heard. Sure, other people might be able to get online, but can you both get online and say a message in a concise way and get that message heard? Because at this point, attention is a currency. And if no one is buying what you're selling, your words will not be heard. That's just how it works, unfortunately. So you have to meet some pretty specific criteria, some unspoken criteria, to be able to, I guess, get your message out there, which is limiting in and of itself.
Obviously, the people who have these higher support needs, they're not the ones who are out there communicating about those things. I think that's where it gets a little bit confused about what those traits might look like in different individuals. And I always go back to the importance of a both and in most of these conversations, and recognizing that one doesn't take away from the other. Being more inclusive is better because it meets more people's needs. And we can just make sure that we're being really intentional with that inclusion. If
I were to add an action item, which I feel like I really try hard to do in my social media presence, not to just complain, but complaining plus the solution. And if I had to give a solution, it would be that when we talk as people who are language-abled autistic adults about our experiences, we have to use modifiers. So we don't need to be saying, autistics always need more context, or autistic friendships are so much easier to navigate because our communication is the same. That's using very broad general terms. Instead, I really believe we need to start using modifiers. Some autistic friendships are easier to navigate because our communication can be the same. Or autistics sometimes like to be told why. Or many autistics need to be told why. But to just say all is very exclusionary. And again, I think that precision is what helps us talk about our experiences without being exclusive.
There's one other topic here that I feel like gets lost when we don't have enough nuance about it, and that's about ABA therapy.
Oh, boy.
And, in full disclosure, we've had guests on this podcast who are very vocal about ABA therapy. Most of them are very negative.
Yeah.
And I think that's fair. There are some autistic adults who have really spoken out about how ABA was harmful for them. And there's a growing movement for it to even be reformed or possibly even eliminated. But at the same time, there are some families who still find aspects of ABA really helpful depending on how it's implemented. So you work as a registered behavior technician. And so you have a very unique perspective, both as an autistic individual and also a professional who is supporting autistic individuals through ABA ideas and concepts. So where have you seen this be helpful? And what are some of the concerns that you think are worth addressing?
One of the things I talk about in my book, in that chapter about ABA therapy, is that one of the advantages is ABA is available when and where you need it. So if you are having a really hard time at the doctor's office, you can get support in the doctor's office. You're not going to your 1 hour every Thursday afternoon scheduled session with your counselor to talk about all your thoughts and feelings that you might have about the doctor's office. We're at the doctor's office providing support in real time. And to my knowledge, there is not really another therapy that is able to kind of help people when and where they need that support. And that being one of the major draws to ABA, in my opinion.
And what are some of the things that you feel like are perhaps changes that could or should be made? I know the field is evolving, and I'd love to get your insight from inside the profession.
I think like any other therapy or education or any other service delivery, your quality of service is only as good as your service provider. But again, that's everything. Your quality of education is only as good as your teacher. Your quality of counseling is only as good as your counselor. So that's to say that there's bad therapists, there's bad teachers, there's bad nurses and doctors everywhere, which certainly does not excuse some of the fundamental flaws that came about as, the result of what ABA was built on. However, previously there was an emphasis on what they said or called making a child appear indistinguishable from their neurotypical peers. That was supposed to be the goal of ABA therapy. And certainly there are, I'm sure, providers still out there who adhere to that. They're not the providers that I interact with. That is long gone. Rather, we are changing environments to meet the needs of people rather than changing people to meet the needs of their environments. And I think that's a huge shift because that means we're no longer focusing on teaching people to mask. There is no suppression of stims. There is no withholding of your special interest until you behave in a certain way. These are things that are in line with neurodiversity affirming care. If it doesn't hurt anybody, you're welcome to do it. And if it does hurt somebody, we're going to find a way to get your need met without just removing things from you. It's not about removing or diminishing bad behaviors or what, we would think of as bad behaviors, but rather how can we help you get what you need in this situation? So it's about replacing behaviors that may not be helpful.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And I don't think anybody goes into the field without the goal of helping people.
Right.
And I think it's always one of those things that when you know better, you do better. And I think all of it is evolving. I'm not an ABA therapist. I'm a LPC. I'm a licensed professional counselor. But that's the same. I mean, there's a lot of similarities there with how we used to approach supporting neurodivergent people, even from the time that I started my practice. And I would never use the same interventions now as I did back then, because that's just how fast it's changing and our understanding is changing of it.
Yeah.
So another thing I wanted to talk to you about was declarative language. So we actually did an episode on declarative language, which I thought was really useful. So for listeners who might not be familiar, declarative language is this communication strategy where instead of giving direct instructions or asking a lot of questions, we make observations or share our own thoughts without expecting a direct response. So like, for example, instead of saying, get started on your work, you might say, I notice you're still thinking about getting started on your homework or something like that. And so it's often mentioned in this context of demand avoidance, which is kind of how it was contextualized even on the episode that we did. But you've written about how it can be a broader tool for building communication and connection and reducing pressure in communication, especially for autistic individuals who maybe find back and forth conversation demanding or stressful. I'd love to hear you elaborate on how we can use that declarative language tool in other ways just beyond getting somebody to do something that they don't want to do.
I love this question. So I clinically use this a lot when I play with my learners. I'm working primarily with older elementary, high school, middle school age kids. And these are kids with an autism diagnosis. And oftentimes, folks with an autism diagnosis are resistant to trying new activities. Even if it's maybe something they might be interested in, if they haven't done it before, they might experience a little bit of resistance, which can be natural. And sometimes it can be helpful to kind of overcome that resistance. But by overcoming that resistance, we certainly don't want to force people to play with new things or try new activities. That's certainly not how you would get somebody to like something. So a lot of times with my clients, I'll bring in a new toy or a new game or new object and encourage them to play with whatever same toy or same object they've been previously engaging with. I'm going to go play with the new toy right beside you. I'll still comment on what you're doing. I'll still interact with you and what you're doing. But I'm going to use declarative language to say, I'm setting up the army men. Oh man, I wonder what's going to happen next. And just leaving it there. And if they feel compelled to join in or to imitate me, fantastic. If not, that's fine. I'll put it away and we'll try it again later. It's not a big deal. There's no strings attached to it whatsoever. And that's what I really like about it.
Yeah, there's no pressure. You have to come up with a response right now that is appropriate or whatever, which requires so much cognitive load to try to figure that out if it isn't something that is automatic or easy. And I also feel like there's something about just building that rapport and that trust by not having somebody feel like, I don't know, they said something to me and I just didn't know what to say, because there is no expectation there. And they probably get that quite a bit in other environments. Mm-hmm. And so you've really found that it helps to build those relationships.
Oh, yeah.
Another thing that goes along with this declarative language and the communication piece. So as a mental health clinician, I was trained to rely very heavily on open-ended questions. So questions like, how did that make you feel? Or what do you think you'll do next? To create this space for reflection and open dialogue. But in practice, especially with my autistic clients, I've really found that too much of that makes the conversation so much harder. And so it was interesting, as I worked with neurodivergent clients more, I found myself falling back on more close-ended questions, something like, was that frustrating or just confusing? And I remember questioning myself quite a bit as a clinician, going, I feel like I'm doing something wrong. But I also knew it was maybe what my clients needed a little bit more, because it was just helping them to engage more meaningfully. Can you talk a little bit about how offering specificity and reducing ambiguity can help make communication more accessible?
Yeah, I feel like specific questions tell me which information fills the gap. Because historically, when we ask these broad, open-ended questions, we're relying on the other person to use the social subtext to understand what information the question asker already has and what information might be missing, and then make a decision based on that, which is really, really hard to do if you have autism and you struggle to understand what information is shared knowledge, what information is information you already have, what information is general knowledge, and what information do I have that you don't. That's a lot of moving parts. And that's why specificity can be so helpful in really narrowing down what's being asked and what piece of information fills that gap.
Kaelynn, I am just really grateful for your time today. As we wrap up, I always like to ask just one final question. If someone is listening today and they've just learned their child is autistic and they're feeling completely overwhelmed, like they just don't even know where to start, what is the message that you would just most want them to hear?
I think if I had to pick a thing, I would say that if you feel alone in your experiences, it means that you just haven't met the right people yet. They're out there. You know, people say, oh, you're not alone. And when I say you're not alone, I mean, there are people out there, you just have to find them. That would be my piece of advice.
I feel like that's really powerful and it's so impactful for people. Kaelynn Partlow, author of Life on the Bridge, thank you so much for your time today.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
I've been thinking about what Kaelynn said about the superpower narrative and how sometimes even the most well-meaning language can flatten a much more complicated reality. It's not that we shouldn't celebrate strengths. That matters. But when we boil someone's experience down to a single feel-good phrase, we risk missing the full picture, especially for people who don't see themselves in that kind of framing. The truth is, strength doesn't mean there's no struggle. And maybe the most affirming thing we can do is make space for both. Let people be whole, just as they are, even when that's messy or hard to categorize, or doesn't fit neatly into the stories we're used to telling. I'm Emily Kircher-Morris. I'll see you next time on the Neurodiversity Podcast.
Thanks again, Kaelynn Partlow. We included links for Kaelynn in the show notes. Emily just got home from a great trip to help train teachers. And by the way, if you run into her at some point, ask her about her amazing flight experience. She got home this morning at like 1 a.m. And I heard her muttering to herself something about the jet packs we've been promised and where they are at this point. But if you'd like for Emily to travel to your location and help train your staff or present at your company or organization's event, click the link called Emily on the Road at neurodiversitypodcast.com. Our host is Emily Kircher-Morris. Corey Orrick is our office manager and production assistant. I'm the executive producer, Dave Morris. For all of us, thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time. This is a service of the Neurodiversity Alliance.